Hello everyone, this lesson is on salamanders for Unit 6 Amphibians and Reptiles. Salamanders may very well be my favorite kind of animal. This salamander here is depicted in 1350 as surviving unharmed in a fire. What they used to do is get logs out of the forest to burn, and these rotting, decomposing logs be very moist, great habitat for salamanders. So then when they would throw them on the fire, salamanders would crawl out of the fire because they're trying to get out of these logs that are burning. But it led to the myth that salamanders were actually born from fire. I'm going to talk a little bit about their classification and what that has to do with their metamorphosis, how they can regenerate or use chemicals as defense, as well as their ecological importance. So, again, just like the frogs, they're an Animalia, Chordata, and Amphibia. They're animals with backbones, and they have half terrestrial, half aquatic life. Their order is called Rhodella, and that's all salamanders. But there's a lot of variation in the kinds of salamanders that we could see. But all of them are going to go through the metamorphosis, start as similar to a tadpole where they have the tail, and then grow the limbs and other structures for terrestrial life as they develop. Gills are going to be super important to all of the larvae, which are going to absorb oxygen from their environment, release the CO2 just like your lungs do, as well as to some adults. Mole salamanders are a category of large salamanders that you can see they kind of have these ribbed structures, but they have lungs, and they are going to be very terrestrial as adults. The marbled salamander is our state salamander of North Carolina. They're going to have all four limbs as adults. The spotted salamander, for example, here is a mole salamander. You can see it starts off with gills as the larvae, and then loses those as an adult, but gains the limbs and the lungs. Lungless salamanders, however, don't have lungs as adults. They lose their gills, but on land as adults, they stay around water and they breathe strictly through their skin, and then typically they're going to be a lot smaller. And this is where most of our diversity of salamanders is found. There's actually a whole lot of lungless salamanders found in North Carolina. Some salamanders, however, retain this aquatic lifestyle. They stay in the water as larvae and as adults, and because of that, they keep their gills. They just get bigger and get bigger gills. And that would include water dogs, mud puppies, and sometimes the adult newts, which the newts are a little special though, because they have the larvae gill stage, and they return back to the water as adults to reproduce and stay in the water, like this eastern newt here. But as a middle juvenile kind of teenager stage, they become terrestrial for a time before returning to the water. This is called a red eft. It's still the eastern newt, but at just a different stage. And he's very red because he's telling all of the predators that, or would-be predators, that he's very toxic. It's called aposematic coloring, or aposematic coloration, meaning this is a dangerous color, stay away from me, I'm not worth eating, like a lot of other things, bees for instance. Giant salamanders, although they do have lungs, they also stay in the water throughout their adult life, and instead of using the lungs, they typically use their skin. And being a larger salamander, they have to have a lot of skin, and these big folds of skin they use to breathe are called frills. You can see how big he is being held by this biologist here. So some of them have lungs as adults, but many of them don't, so some of them still breathe through gills or even through their skin, and that really gives us our classification categories of salamanders. Some other really cool traits, they can regenerate. limbs, even eyes, and complex tissue, which is super fascinating and a really important research topic for medicine, and it's got potential for human application. Maybe not a whole limb, but some vital tissue like spinal tissue, for instance. In the ecosystem, there was a measurement done of all the salamanders in the Great Smoky Mountains, or at least an estimation of them. And it turns out that of all vertebrates in the Great Smoky Mountains, mammals, birds, reptiles, they would be outweighed by all of the salamanders in the Great Smoky Mountains. So ecologically, they are vital to the health of the ecosystem. The defense of our salamanders can come in many varieties. For instance, the toxicity of the red eft. It's also adapted by this lungless salamander here, the red salamander, who is slightly toxic, but is not anywhere near as toxic as that red eft. And what he's doing is he's mimicking that toxicity instead. So he can pretend that he's toxic as a defense mechanism. If he does get potentially injured running from an organism, he could slip away with his slimy skin, and if he loses a limb, he can regenerate it as well. But they play a big role in the ecosystem as a link in the food chain, eating a lot of the invertebrates, the pests, as well as being food for some of the larger organisms like snakes and birds. This great heron here, for instance, is eating what is known as a Neuse River water dog, a very large salamander. But it's worth their conservation. They are at threat, just like the frogs and other amphibians. Their sensitive skin leaves them susceptible to climate change and fungi and water pollution, as well as all the habitat loss that's occurring. We want to keep them around because of the potential research, their use as a bioindicator, and their actions as pest control, eating all those small invertebrates, and just being a link in the food chain, being part of the food chain. So solutions to this are aimed at improving the quality of the air and water. They're susceptible to runoff from agriculture, to low oxygen water, to acid rain is going to really harm their skin. So directing our efforts towards agricultural improvements, making sure not as much runoff is affecting the water quality, making sure there's not as much pollution, making acid rain, and protecting their habitats so that they have a safe place to stay. And that's it for salamanders. I hope you enjoyed them as much as I do.